in this session after lunch, we're going to go into the compassioning of practice, just so that we can have some balance, because both the Shamatha practice and the Vipashyana practice that we're going to do in the second half of the retreat, both of those, due to the type of practice they are, is that you can become a little bit self-absorbed in those practices and even become a little bit disconnected. And particularly the Shamatha practice, what can often happen is that when we start to get a little taste of that inner tranquility, that inner peace in Shamatha, we can get attracted to that and feel like, wow, that's really nice, and just sort of use that as a way of withdrawing from all that mess out there into our little bubble of peace. And that's not a very healthy direction for practice, because all this practice is about not withdrawing from the world, but having a better platform to engage in the world. And so to avoid going in that direction with this or the Vipashyana practice, we need to really balance with the compassioning of practice to stay connected with the world. And so that's what we're going to do in this session each day. And there are a number of qualities that we are going to be cultivating there. The first one that we're going to be looking at today is loving kindness. And loving kindness here is a translation of the Sanskrit term Maitri and the Pali term Metta. And Maitri and Metta are defined as the wish or aspiration for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And so what we see here is that Maitri and Metta is an aspiration, it's a wish. An aspirational wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. And so therefore I think it's better to translate them as loving kindness rather than, as sometimes the case, love. Sometimes these are translated as love. But I think that can be a bit misleading, because usually for us the word love is an emotion and often implies some sort of intimate behaviour. But here, Maitri and Metta is not an emotion, it's an aspiration, it's a wish. An aspirational wish for ourselves and others to have happiness and its causes. So I think therefore it's better to translate that as loving kindness rather than as love. Now, of course, most of us already have an aspiration to be happy. But often that aspiration for happiness is misdirected, meaning that not only don't we find happiness, but we also, in addition, often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering on ourselves and the people around us. And that's summarised very nicely again by this great Indian Buddhist master Shantideva in the 8th century, who says, "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery. And with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So, sorry? No. "Those desiring to escape from suffering hasten right toward their own misery, and with the very desire for happiness, out of delusion, they destroy their own well-being as if it were the enemy." So therefore, if we really want to cultivate this loving kindness for ourselves and others, we need to know three things. We need to know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. Because if we don't know those three things, then loving kindness is just words with no meaning. So let's have a look at those three things. What is happiness? What are the causes of happiness? And how do we cultivate those causes? So when we talk about what is happiness, we can really talk about two types of happiness. The first type is often referred to as temporal happiness, another name for our pleasurable experiences. And so, of course, our pleasurable experiences are what's called stimulus-based happiness. We have some sort of stimulus and we have a pleasant experience. And therefore, of course, when the stimulus finishes, the happiness experience finishes, hence temporal or temporary. And therefore, this type of happiness is also often called conditioned happiness. Meaning, we need certain conditions to come together to have that happiness experience. The conditions are not there, no happiness experience. So therefore, by its nature, our pleasurable experiences are transient, meaning when the stimulus finishes, the pleasant experience is finished. They're unreliable, because we can't just click our fingers and have a pleasant experience whenever we want one. It requires a certain stimulus not there, no pleasant experience. And then if we really look closely at our pleasurable experiences, we'll really come to see they're not even really in the nature of happiness. Because if our pleasant experiences were in the nature of happiness, it would mean that the more we engaged in them, the more happy we should become. But we know from our own experience that if we overindulge in our pleasant experiences, not only don't they make us more happy, they often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. Of course, classic example, eating too much of our favourite dessert, or staying too long out in the nice warm sunshine. That if we overindulge, we often induce a lot of unnecessary suffering. So what we can see from that is that our pleasurable experiences are simply relative experiences. Relative to an earlier state or an improvement, but if we overindulge in them, they themselves often turn into suffering. So that's the first type of happiness. The second type is what's referred to as genuine happiness, this state of inner well-being. And this is not a stimulus-based happiness, meaning we don't require any particular stimulus to be in this state of genuine happiness. So we can be in this state of genuine happiness regardless of what's going on around us. And so therefore, this is what's called unconditioned happiness. And therefore, by its nature, it is stable, it is reliable, and it is in the nature of happiness. And so, of course, when we're talking about cultivating loving kindness for ourselves and others, we're, of course, mainly focusing on the second one. Now what we are doing, of course, is what we often do is we conflate the two, meaning that we are hoping that the first one will give us the second one. We're hoping that our pleasurable experiences are going to satisfy us, it's going to fulfill us, that they're going to give us some more lasting type of happiness. And because of that, what happens is we end up with craving and attachment to our pleasant experiences, trying to hold on to them, make them last, make them hopefully satisfy us, fulfill us. But then, of course, if we have craving and attachment for our pleasant experiences, together with that often comes worry and anxiety about not getting them, not getting enough of them or losing them. And also then comes with that a lot of frustration when we don't get them. And even if we do get them, we tend to overindulge in them, and then they often lead to a lot of suffering themselves. And then, of course, we tend to get upset when they come to an end. And then, of course, they never really fully satisfy us, so we often end up with a lot of dissatisfaction and disappointment when things don't live up to our expectations. And then often we feel like, well, the reason I'm not really happy is I just didn't get enough of that thing, so I just need to get more of it, and then I'll really be more happy. So that induces even more craving, so it's a vicious cycle. And of course, the more craving and attachment, then the more frustration, it just gets worse and worse, a never-ending cycle. And in addition to that, of course, our craving and attachment is never satisfied. And we know this from our own experience, is that if there's something we like now, but we get it too often, then after some time, craving and attachment goes, sorry, boring, not good enough anymore. I need something bigger, better, and different. So actually, we end up losing out on the things we used to enjoy because craving and attachment very quickly actually says, sorry, not good enough anymore. It's not stimulating me enough. It's not giving me enough pleasure. And so we discount them. And so we actually lose enjoyment on the things we used to enjoy. So of course, the solution, of course, is to understand there are two types of happiness, and that the first one will never give us the second one. And therefore, we can, instead of hoping the first one gives us the second one, we can strive to actually achieve the second type of happiness. But here, it's not a choice. Because often, people think it's a choice. And in fact, one of the reasons they often feel that is that in Buddhism, we often have this presentation of what's called renunciation. And it's often presented, of course, as the entry point into the Buddhist path. And of course, this word renunciation is about renouncing or giving up. And then often people mistakenly think that giving up means we need to give up pleasure. That if we're a good Buddhist, we need to give up pleasure, wealth, all of those things. Of course, Buddhism never says that. What renunciation is about is not giving up those things, but giving up an unhealthy attitude to those things. So renunciation is about giving up craving and attachment to money, wealth, pleasure, and so forth. Because that's just going to give us suffering. So therefore, if we strive for this genuine happiness and inner well-being, then also, as a byproduct, we're going to enjoy our pleasurable experiences much more than we do now. Because we'll let go of craving and attachment to them, because we'll realise they're never going to fulfill us and satisfy us. And therefore, when those pleasurable experiences come, we'll actually enjoy them more fully than we do now. And that was highlighted to me quite some years ago when I did my first long meditation retreat. I was in a retreat cabin on the side of a mountain in Spain. It was a retreat centre that provided meals, And so every day nearby my hut would be a basket of food delivered. And it was quite nutritious food, but the menu was quite repetitive. And so we know on our own experience, if there's some food we like, but we eat it a couple of days in a row, it doesn't take too many days in a row of eating the same food where we go, oh, not that again. But my experience was exactly the opposite. After about a month of eating this food, it started tasting better. And initially I was convinced that the cook was putting more care and attention into preparing the food. But then a few more weeks went by and it kept tasting better. And then after about 6 weeks of eating the same food, I realised this is exactly the same food as 6 weeks ago. So what had changed? What had changed was that due to being in retreat, my mind was calming down, my craving and attachment was subsiding, and I was actually enjoying the pleasures of eating food much more. In fact, I can honestly say at that time, I had never ever enjoyed food so much ever before in my life. And it wasn't anything special, this food. I mean, it was nutritious, it was quite okay, but it wasn't like, and then also, I was in a cabin on the side of a mountain with a big spacious view, the Mediterranean in the distance, a beautiful view. But again, generally, if we go somewhere where there's a beautiful view, after a few days of being there, we don't even notice the view anymore. But my experience was the view kept getting more and more beautiful. And then after some weeks, even little tiny insignificant things, like tiny little flowers, I'd go, wow, that's so beautiful, so amazing. And so what I was finding is that my appreciation and the experience of pleasurable things, of beauty, just increased. Because the craving and attachment was subsiding. So of course that's what Buddhism, of course, says, and that was certainly my experience. So if we can really make that shift in terms of striving for genuine happiness, I think that's what you're going to find. You're going to find that the simple pleasures in life you'll enjoy much more than you do now. But what are the causes of this genuine happiness? It's all well and good to say, let's strive for genuine happiness, but if we don't know what the causes are, then what are we going to do? So what are the causes of genuine happiness? So of course the foundation, the first cause is ethics, meaning avoid harmful behaviour, because of course if we're engaging in harmful behaviour, then a lot of suffering is going to result as a result of that. So that's really the opposite of genuine happiness, if we're creating harmful behaviour for ourselves or others. And then of course on that basis, we engage in the concentration practice to develop single-pointed concentration. So of course here we're calling that Shamatha. And already, simply by engaging in concentration practice, we're going to have a little taste of this genuine happiness, this inner well-being. Because with this concentration practice, our mind will calm down, and therefore all the mental afflictions that agitate the mind will calm down, and we'll start to have a little taste of that inner well-being. But then to really achieve that state, we need the third cause, the third practice, which is the wisdom practice. And of course we're referring to that here by the name Vipashyana, because here the wisdom practice is to come to realise the nature of reality, because the Buddhist assertion is it's our distorted view of reality that is the root cause of our mental afflictions and suffering. So if we want to overcome that and really achieve this state of genuine happiness of inner well-being, we need to eliminate this distorted view of reality in our mind. And so this then will lead us really to this state of genuine happiness of inner well-being. Any questions so far?
I've experienced, maybe genuine happiness is not, it's not really long lasting.
Not long lasting.
Because it depends on the practice itself. Like, I had some times that I practiced and I felt this extension and love, and then it fades away after a while. So,
exactly.
So it's not really long-lasting. It depends on the practice.
Yes and no. It depends on how well we're doing the practice. And this is something we're going to really touch on in the second half of the retreat when we go into the Vipashyana, is that we can do some Vipashyana practice and have a little taste of this, and it'll, like I said, it'll wear off. Why? Because we're not, we don't have the basis, we don't have the shamatha, that the Vipashyana practice is only strong enough to temporarily give us a little taste of that genuine happiness and inner well-being. But it's like purifying our mind of all these mental afflictions and so forth. To fully do that, we need, as a basis, we need the shamatha practice. If we don't have shamatha practice, at best, it can give us some quite strong experience. And it may last for some minutes, hours, even days. We may be in this very quite good state, but then slowly it'll wear off. So we need to move to the next level of practice, and we're going to talk a lot about that in the second half of the retreat. So it is true, and that's often the conclusion people come to. They do this practice, they have this little taste, and they go, well, it's also just fleeting, it's just fleeting. But if you look at the texts on these practice closely, you'll see the reason it's fleeting is we haven't gone deep enough in these practices, and how to do that, of course, we'll look at.
It's a process of learning. First you have a glimpse, and then once
you... Yeah, it's a process, and in fact, having a glimpse is very important because it validates the fact that, wow, there is this state of inner well-being. I've had a taste of it, so let's move towards that fully now. If you don't have that taste, you may do some practice and nothing much happens. You go, well, I practiced, but nothing really happened. I think this is not true. I give up. So yes, if we have that, that can really validate that, wow, this is maybe possible, so let's keep working on that.
Can you elaborate on the word unconditioned?
Yeah. Unconditioned here means that when you achieve that state, then you can be in that state without having certain conditions coming together. It's like, what would be an example, an analogy that would work? If you had some water and it had sediment in it, and it looked murky, it wasn't clear. But then and then what you can do temporarily is you just put that down and it'll sink to the bottom. But then if you shake it up again, it's back to normal. Whereas if you removed that sediment, then that water would be clear no matter what you did with it, shake it or whatever. So there's no conditions. After you remove the dirt, then there's no conditions that you need to have that clarity of water. It's always there. But if you don't achieve that, then you need certain conditions, like you need the water to be very still to have that little taste. Does that sort of make sense? So what I'm saying is that we need to do certain things to achieve that state, but once we achieve that state, then there's nothing that can disturb that state, therefore unconditioned. And therefore there's no conditions we need to be in that state or that can pop us out of that state. It'll be there all the time. That's what unconditioned means. Whereas, of course, pleasurable only comes when we have a stimulus, external or internal. There's a condition there. We need a condition to have the pleasure. But once we achieve this state, then we don't need any particular conditions. In fact, the surroundings can be quite hostile, and we're still in that state of genuine happiness. We don't need nice things around us to stay in that state.
Sounds a bit unrealistic, even in Buddhist.
Unrealistic.
To me, even in Buddhist logic, like to have an unconditioned state.
An unconditioned state. But then we unrealistic to have clean water.
Clean water can be dirt.
No, not if it's sealed. If no dirt can get in. Once it's clean, it's clean.
Yeah, but then it can be messed up again.
How? You only have to bring dirt in. But see, here the thing is, this is what we're going to look at in the second half, is that there has to be a cause. So water can't become dirty without a cause. The cause is, of course, dirt coming in. And we'll talk more about this in the second half, you can't have something coming from nothing, basically. So once something is pure, it can't suddenly become impure. There can only be a cause. Of course, in the analogy, there's always dirt, but it's only an analogy, it's not an example. It would be like, to make it really fit perfectly, it would like we've got rid of all the dirt in the universe. We've got rid of all the dirt in the universe and there's water there. Can it become dirty? But of course, it's an analogy, it's not an example. But we'll talk more about that in the second half.
Striving for genuine happiness is a form of craving. Isn't it contradicting?
So striving for genuine happiness is a form of craving. Not necessarily. If we allow craving and attachment to come into that striving, that will cause problems. So we can strive for something, we can aspire to something without necessarily craving it or having attachment. For us now, of course, at our level, probably not so easy, because craving and attachment really dominates our life, but we can, it's striving or aspiring is not attachment. There's two things there. There's striving for something, and then of course if attachment comes into it, then that will interfere with that. That will cause problems, because we'll have frustration, we'll get agitated, and that will derail our striving for something. And we know that from our own experience. Like, if we're striving for something good in our life, but then we start craving it, what happens to what we do? It doesn't go very well, does it? We get agitated, we get frustrated, we don't actually move forward very well. But if we can let that go as much as possible, then when we strive, we can actually make pretty good progress in anything we do in our life. Okay. So therefore, if we know that these causes for genuine happiness, and we know how to practice the Shamatha and the Vipashyana, then, of course, loving kindness has meaning. Because then we know what is happiness, what are the causes of happiness, and how do we cultivate those causes. And so then we can really cultivate loving kindness for ourselves and others.